Welcome to my channel. I hope today's story captures your interest and leaves you wanting more. Your continued support truly means a lot to me. Now, let's get started with the story.
I switched my daughter-in-law's seat on her wedding day. It was the quietest decision I ever made, and the coldest one of my life. No one knew that the chair she was about to sit in had been prepared to humiliate my wife in front of hundreds of people. No one knew my son was standing guard to make sure that plan went through. And no one imagined that I had seen everything from the very beginning. At a wedding that cost $250,000, the dirtiest thing was not on the floor. It was inside people's hearts. Before I continue, if you're listening to this story from anywhere in the world, take 1 second to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps stories like this travel farther. And now, let me take you back to that morning, when everything still looked like a perfect day. I sat alone in the study on the second floor, where I could look straight out over the Charleston beach, stretching under the sunlight. Outside, white chairs were lined up neatly on the sand. Sheer fabric drifted softly in the ocean breeze. Everything was arranged to look like a perfect dream. The rehearsal music played at an even pace, soft enough to make people believe this was a happy day. But I knew, days like that often hide the most. My family did not become wealthy overnight. Our hotel chain was built after the war, one brick at a time, one contract at a time. I spent nearly my entire life on discipline, on order, and on keeping my word. Ella, my wife, stood behind it all. She never appeared in newspapers. She never stepped onto a stage. But every important decision of my life carried her presence. Maybe that's why I always believed this. If someone does not respect Ella, they do not respect any value at all. Kyle is my youngest son. He grew up with abundance, yet always felt deprived. He was used to pointing his finger and having someone else pay the price. The first time Kyle brought Lauren home, I felt something was off. She smiled a lot. She said exactly what people wanted to hear. And she always held her phone like it was part of her body. Ella tried to be close to her future daughter-in-law. She asked questions. She gave way. She even took the blame for small things that were not her fault. I saw all of it. And I also saw how Lauren received it, as if it were only natural. This wedding was not my wish. Kyle and Lauren came to me with a long budget proposal. The final number was $250,000. They talked about image, about status, about how the guests needed to remember it forever. Ella stayed quiet. She only nodded slightly when I asked for her opinion. She was always like that, choosing peace over argument. I agreed, not because of the wedding, but because I thought this might be the last chance for this family to stand on the same side. But the closer the day came, the more something felt misaligned. Lauren often avoided Ella. When they did meet her, smile never reached her eyes. Kyle grew more irritable than usual. He talked a lot about entitlement, about the future, about what should belong to him. I had heard those words for years, but this time they sounded different, more urgent, more impatient. On the wedding morning, I passed by the preparation area and accidentally heard laughter from the makeup room. The door was half closed. I am not in the habit of eavesdropping, but Ella's name was spoken clearly enough to make me stop. Lauren was talking. Her voice was light, as if she were sharing a funny story. She called my wife an old wallet. She said people like Ella only sit in the front row and ruin the pictures. Then she mentioned a surprise gift, something that made the whole room burst into laughter. I stood there, my hand against the wall, feeling the cold spread up my arm. I did not walk in. I did not confront anyone. I turned away as if I had heard nothing. In the military, I learned that the first reaction is often the worst one. What unsettled me most was not Lauren's words, but Kyle's silence in that conversation. A silence of agreement. Back in the study, I looked out at the ocean for a long time. Ella was downstairs then, having her shawl adjusted by a friend. She looked elegant and calm, as if this were just another ordinary afternoon. I wondered how many times in life kindness is mistaken for weakness. How many times patience is confused with having no limits. Outside, the wedding continued to take shape. Every small detail was placed exactly where it belonged. But in my mind, everything had already begun to shift. I did not know exactly what that surprise gift was. But I knew one thing for certain. It was not meant for the family. And when a joke is built on the intention to humiliate someone, it is no longer a joke. I stood up, adjusted my vest, and told myself this. There are days when a father's duty is not to comfort but to observe, until the truth reveals itself. That day, under the Charleston sun, I chose silence. But that silence was not forgiveness. It was only the first step. I left the study when the sun was already higher in the sky. Outside, the air was growing busy. Footsteps, voices calling out, the final test of the music blending together. I walked slowly, not because of my age, but because I wanted to see everything clearly. When a man has lived long enough, he understands this. The most decisive moments are rarely loud. They happen quietly, in corners most people never notice. The VIP seating area was set up close to the edge of the sand. The front row was reserved for family. Ella's name sat neatly on a small placard, the lettering elegant and precise. I stopped for a few seconds, just to be sure I wasn't mistaken. Everything looked perfectly normal. And if I hadn't heard those words in the makeup room, I would have turned away and believed this day would pass like any other. There were 15 minutes left before the ceremony began. Lauren appeared from behind, still in her wedding dress, but with the veil removed. She didn't notice me. Her eyes kept scanning around as if checking whether anyone was watching. I stepped back half a pace, standing behind a decorative pillar. That wasn't curiosity. It was a reflex, shaped over many years. Lauren bent down beside the chair with Ella's name on it. From a small handbag, she pulled out a clear bottle of adhesive. I recognized it immediately. Industrial glue, the kind used to bond metal and wood, not something a person carries by accident. She opened the cap and squeezed gently. A thick layer spread across the seat. Not fast, not rushed, careful and cold. I thought I would feel anger, but I didn't. The first feeling was clarity. Every piece I had heard that morning clicked into place. Kyle stood a few yards away. His back was turned toward Lauren, but his head was slightly tilted like someone listening closely. When Lauren finished, he turned around and smiled faintly. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. He said Mom always liked attention, that this was just a way to teach her a lesson, that when everyone stood up to applaud, the dress wouldn't stay intact. I looked at my son, and in that moment I didn't recognize him anymore. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Calm, casual, as if he were talking about the weather. Lauren capped the bottle and slipped it back into her bag. She stood up straight, adjusted her dress, and walked away, leaving the chair silent under the sun. Kyle followed behind her. He never looked back. I stayed there for a few more seconds. The sea breeze moved the white ribbons gently. No one around noticed what had just happened. I knew that if I stepped out then, if I called their names, everything would explode immediately. But explosions don't always bring justice. Sometimes they only bring chaos. I bent down toward the chair. The glue was still wet. I reached my hand close, then stopped. I didn't need to touch it to know what it would do. In my mind, my years in the military returned. Lessons about control, about observation, about using an opponent's own actions to expose them. I didn't think long. The decision came naturally, as if I had known what I would do from the moment I heard that laughter in the makeup room. I removed the name placard that read Ella from the chair. No rush, no attention drawn. I walked to the main table where the bride's chair sat, in the most honored position. I looked around. Everyone was busy with final details. No one noticed an old man with gray hair holding 2 small placards. I switched them. The chair with the glue was placed in the bride's position. The clean chair went back to the family row where Ella would sit. I adjusted everything carefully, made sure it looked perfect just as before. When I stood up, no alarm sounded. No suspicious eyes turned toward me. I stepped back into the crowd. My heart beat steady, not from nerves, but from something else. Certainty. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it to stop a humiliation that had been carefully planned, and to let the truth find its own way into the light. A few minutes later, I saw Ella walking toward the family row. She smiled at me, that familiar, calm smile. She sat down in her seat, unaware that just minutes earlier that place had carried a different intention. I nodded slightly to her, a quiet reassurance. The music began. Guests settled into their seats. Lauren appeared again, this time with her veil covering her face. She walked slowly, confidently, like someone who believed everything was under her control. I stood in the back, watching every step. There were no questions left in my mind now. Only one clear thought. Some traps are dug for others to fall into, but some traps are simply waiting for the right person to come back and sit on them themselves. And that was how the ceremony began, with all its perfect appearances intact. The music softened and the ceremony moved forward with a precision that felt almost artificial. I stood slightly toward the back, close enough to catch every small movement, far enough to avoid the meaningless handshakes. Lauren recited her vows with a steady voice, as if every word had been practiced many times in front of a mirror. Kyle repeated after her. His eyes flicked briefly toward the family row where Ella sat upright, hands folded neatly on her lap. Nothing happened, and it was that calm that told me the climax had not arrived yet. When the applause closed the formal ceremony, I felt a slight pressure against the inside of my vest pocket. Kyle had asked me that morning to hold on to some documents for him, saying his jacket was too tight. I had nodded then, without asking much. Now, as we waited to move toward the reception area, I slipped my hand into my pocket, only intending to straighten things out. The stiff paper touched my fingers in a way that felt unfamiliar. I am not in the habit of reading other people's documents, but some things in life do not arrive through courtesy. I pulled the papers out, opened the first page, and with one glance at the signature, I understood why Kyle hadn't wanted to keep them himself. My name was there. My signature was there, but I had not signed it. It was a provisional will attached to a transfer of usage rights for the Charleston estate. The effective date was clearly written immediately after the wedding. Every line was carefully worded, enough to fool someone who only skimmed. But I had signed too many documents in my life not to see the difference. The handwriting was harder, the pressure uneven, a copy born from haste and greed. I folded the papers back up. The feeling in my chest was not shock. It was confirmation. The words I had overheard that morning. The prepared chair. The impatience in Kyle's eyes. Everything revolved around one thing. Ownership. Not family. Not kinship. Just assets. Guests began moving toward the reception area. I slipped the papers back into my vest pocket and chose not to say anything yet. Not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to see clearly how they would behave once they believed everything was already in their hands. Truth, like the tide, needs the right moment to rise. The reception was lavishly arranged. Warm golden lights fell over tables dressed in white cloth. The main table stood at the center, slightly elevated, drawing every gaze. I watched Lauren walk to her chair, the name placard placed neatly in front. She didn't look down. She didn't check. The confidence of someone who believes her plan has succeeded leaves no room for doubt. Ella sat at the family table, speaking softly with a few acquaintances. She looked more at ease than she had that morning. I looked at her then, at the papers in my pocket, and realized that some forms of protection do not happen in a single moment, but stretch across years through every decision one is forced to make. The MC began the opening remarks. Lauren smiled, stood up, and waved to the guests, like someone long familiar with cameras. She spoke about love, about the journey, about the challenges they had overcome. Every sentence was polished to sound perfect on the live stream. Kyle stood beside her, one hand resting on the back of the chair. His eyes drifted toward me from time to time as if waiting for some sign of approval. I gave none. I only listened. As Lauren spoke, the contrast between image and nature became clearer than ever. A person can speak endlessly about family and still prepare documents to take it from them. A person can wear white and still plan to humiliate someone on a day meant to be sacred. When the speech ended, the MC invited the bride to sit to prepare for the next segment, a commemorative video. Lauren turned back to her chair. She placed her hand on the seat and sat down with the confidence of someone expecting the next round of applause. I watched that moment without blinking, not because I wished for something bad to happen, but because I knew every disguise has its limit. I adjusted my cuff, feeling the papers still there in my pocket. The forged will. The transfer documents. Things created to take, not to build. I didn't know exactly when I would speak. I only knew that when I did, I would speak once enough to never repeat myself. The video began to play. The lights in the reception hall dimmed. Old images filled the large screen. Kyle as a child. Beach trips. Family evenings. I heard a few emotional sighs in the room. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at Lauren. She sat straight-backed, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed forward, completely unaware that the chair beneath her was holding tighter than any vow that had just been spoken. In my mind, everything was ready. No doubt, no hesitation. When the truth is already in your hands, the only thing left is to wait for the right moment to place it under the light. And that moment, I knew, was very close. The video was still playing when the MC spoke up. His voice was gentle but clear enough to cut through the emotion in the room. He invited the bride to stand and receive a special surprise from friends. It was a familiar moment in weddings like this, a moment designed to cue applause and tears at just the right time. Lauren smiled. She placed both hands on the edges of the chair, preparing to stand just as she had practiced in front of the mirror countless times. I saw that confidence clearly. It didn't come from happiness. It came from believing she was in control. Then everything stopped. Lauren leaned forward, but her lower body didn't move. The smile on her face froze like a photograph caught between two frames. She tried again, this time with more force. The chair made a soft sound. Not loud, but unusual enough for a few people at nearby tables to turn their heads. Kyle frowned and leaned down, whispering something to her. Lauren shook her head and whispered back, her voice tense. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her hand tighten around the edge of the table. The MC hesitated on stage, trying to keep the program moving with a weak joke. No one laughed. Kyle placed a hand on Lauren's shoulder and pulled gently. That was the first moment the wedding dress made a sound I know Lauren will never forget. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't violent. Just a dry, tearing sound carried through the microphones in a room that had gone completely silent. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Lauren let out a short cry, not from pain but from panic. She bent forward, trying to cover the part of the dress that was no longer intact. Kyle froze his hands, hovering, unsure whether to pull again or let go. All eyes turned toward the main table. Phones were raised by instinct, then quickly lowered as people realized this was no longer entertainment. I stayed seated. I didn't stand up. I didn't look around. I only looked at Lauren, held in place by the very chair she had prepared for someone else. Silence spread through the room, thick, heavy, like air no one knew how to break. The MC stumbled through a few apologies, suggesting a brief pause. Event staff started moving closer. Then Kyle pulled again. This time, the tearing sound was clearer. Lauren broke down. Not the kind of crying meant for cameras, but the collapse of someone who had just realized she had crossed a line she could never step back over. I stood up. The sound of my chair was small, but in that moment it was enough to draw attention. I walked slowly toward the stage and took the microphone from the MC's unsteady hands. I felt Ella's gaze on my back, but I didn't turn around. I knew she trusted me, as she had for many years. I'm sorry, I said, my voice calm. Perhaps this is the moment we need to pause. The room fell completely silent. I looked directly at Lauren. She looked up, eyes red, her makeup beginning to lose control. In that moment, she was no longer a bride, no longer an influencer, just a young person who was afraid. Lauren, I continued, keeping my voice steady. You once said this wedding needed an unforgettable memory. You were right. I paused, long enough for everyone to feel that I was choosing each word carefully. But before we call this an accident, I said, perhaps you should explain why the chair meant for my wife was coated with industrial glue, and why my son was standing guard to make sure it happened. A wave of murmurs spread through the room, no longer containable. Kyle spun toward me. His face went pale. Dad, he started, then stopped when he met my eyes. I wasn't angry. I didn't need to be. And while we're speaking of things that were carefully prepared, I went on, I'd also like to ask about the documents Kyle asked me to hold on to this morning. I reached into my vest pocket and pulled out the papers, holding them up without opening them. That gesture alone made Kyle step back half a pace. This is a will and a transfer agreement, I said. In my name, with a signature made very carefully, but not carefully enough to fool me. No one spoke. I could hear the ocean waves in the distance, steady, relentless. Lauren looked from the chair beneath her to the papers in my hand, then down at her wedding dress. Every layer she had built for this day was collapsing, piece by piece, in front of the very people she had wanted to impress. I lowered the microphone slightly, my voice deeper. I'm not standing here to humiliate anyone, I said. I'm standing here because some jokes are not jokes, and some documents are not mistakes. I handed the microphone back to the MC and turned toward my seat. I didn't wait for reactions. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be exposed was already in plain sight. Lauren remained stuck to the chair. Kyle stood beside her, out of words. And in that heavy silence, I knew it. The point of no return had been crossed. After I returned to my seat, no one had the confidence to call it a party anymore. The music was turned off completely. The event staff gathered in small groups, whispering their eyes, drifting toward the main table, then quickly away. Lauren remained seated, motionless. She no longer tried to stand. Kyle stood beside her, his shoulders heavy, as if for the first time in his life he understood that some things cannot be fixed with an apology. I sat next to Ella. She took my hand very lightly. She didn't ask anything. She didn't need to. That quiet moment was all the confirmation I needed. I leaned in and whispered that everything would be all right. Ella nodded, her eyes facing forward, calm in a way that made my chest ache. There are women who spend their entire lives holding a family together, and only when they are pushed to the edge do others finally understand the weight of that patience. I signaled to the estate manager. We spoke briefly. No raised voices. A few phone calls were made, enough for the appropriate legal parties to arrive and formally document the situation involving the paperwork. No one was dragged away. There was no chaos. Only questions that needed answers, and answers that would no longer be given on a stage. Legally speaking, the ceremony ended there. No loud announcement. None was necessary. When the foundation of a marriage is built on deception and humiliation, it collapses on its own. No one needs to push it. I stood up again, this time without a microphone. I walked over to Kyle and Lauren. My voice was low. Only they could hear me. I said today was not the day for arguments. I said they would leave the reception area after everything was handled properly, and before they left, they would personally clean up what remained of this event. Not as punishment, but as understanding. Everything has a price. Kyle looked at me. For the first time, he couldn't find a reason to argue. Lauren lowered her head. The white dress was no longer perfect, but what made her tremble wasn't the fabric. It was the silence of the people around her. A silence louder than any judgment. Night fell slowly. Guests left one by one. No noise. No curiosity. The beach returned to its original emptiness. I saw Kyle and Lauren, along with a few staff members, clearing tables and chairs under the warm yellow lights. Their movements were awkward. No one supervised them. There was no need. Some lessons only matter when a person is forced to face the consequences on their own. Later, I took Ella down to the sand. The sea breeze was cooler, softer. There was no music, no stage lights, only the waves and the darkening sky. I placed my hand on her back slowly, an old habit. Ella leaned into me. And for the first time that day, I felt her breathing truly relax. We danced, without music, just a few slow steps, no need to keep time. I didn't think about what had happened. I didn't think about what would come next. I only thought this sometimes. A good ending isn't everything going back to the way it was, but everything being put back where it belongs. I don't know what Kyle and Lauren will do next. I only know that from that day on, all financial support stopped. Not as punishment, but as a boundary. Family is not something to exploit. It is where you learn responsibility. When we returned to the estate, I turned off all the lights on the terrace. The house grew quiet. I looked at Ella, and in the dim light I saw a very faint smile. It was the smile of someone who had endured long enough, and was finally protected the right way. Before going to bed, I stood on the balcony for a while longer. I thought about the chair, about the papers, about the silence that had spoken for me. And I understood something I had known for a long time. Money can buy a lavish wedding, but it cannot buy respect. And if someone tries to tear apart the dignity of the person who protected them their whole life, they will be the one left with nothing to cover themselves. If you were in my place, would you choose forgiveness? Or would you choose to put everything back within its proper limits? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening to this story. If it made you reflect on family, on boundaries, and on respect, please subscribe, like, and share so stories like this can continue to be told. Money can create a perfect day, but only self-respect can keep a family standing. Remember that before it's too late.